thought that factory was written in ink, and it was watercolor. After she closed on us, I was a telemarketer, a tire salesman, one big job after another. Christmas time. The development that had been planned for downtown, the one that was going to bring big retail stores and jobs for everyone, well, that fizzled on some complicated six-way derivative financing deal, whatever derivative financing deals are. And so long after they tore down the factory, the land stayed vacant, and there were pieces of machinery from the factory left on the ground, too unimportant to sell off, too heavy to move, too bulky to bury, scattered the clues from the lost civilization, droppings of our failure. Might as well be the bones of men who worked there. And that's how the main character, named as Earl, introduces the story. And the first half of the book reads us through his and his family's life from about the end of World War II right up until the mid-1970s. And the dates are significant. At the end of World War II, the United States had the most robust economy the history had ever seen, the most aggressive consumer society, the largest growth spurt that any nation had ever experienced. We sat on top of a very big hill, and a rising tide lifted all boats. People were able to afford homes and appliances and send their kids to school without debt. And the factory jobs fueled all this industrialization. And you could go to work in one of those places in the 1970s, and you could make $26 an hour as a beginning union welder. I hesitate to ask who's making $26 an hour in this room right now. That was in 30 years ago. And there was an understanding among people, between the factories and between the people who were working there. Most of those factories were owned by the people, at the time, the men who had created them. They had built them. The place that forms the archetype of the semi-fictional town, I guess, in here is a place you saw in some of those pictures, West Virginia, where the Weird family found an empty valley that had the Ohio River running across it, built a steel factory there because they could bring coal up from southern West Virginia and Kentucky. They could ship steel upward to Pittsburgh and then further on into the Great Lakes. And a town grew up around it. The factory people who owned it, they built the hospital, they built the schools, they built the sewer system. People in that city did not have to pay city taxes. Everything was taken care of. And in return, they worked in those factories. And they sent their next generations to work in those factories. And it wasn't perfect. There were men who lost their hands in those machines. There were no opportunities for women. There was certainly no sense of compassion, but there was a sense of a social contract. And while it wasn't perfect, it certainly worked. And through a long night, Earl comes to be left aside by his friend. He finds himself walking home through a terrible thunderstorm. Finally runs into one of his dad's friends who offers to give him a ride. When they get in front of his house, the friend starts to talk a little bit about what happened, what was happening then, and what Earl was going to see in the future. He said, "I tell you, Earl, Summers died. He just died, man. When my own dad came home from the war, Japan was a wasteland alongside Europe. And now, somehow, we've done it ourselves here in Ohio, what the Krauts and the Jacks couldn't. Here in this town, we had what we thought was a promise. The factory would give us jobs, we'd work hard, and there'd be nobody sleeping under the railroad bridge the way some people do now. My old man told me it took him 2 months to come home from Japan, by boat, by train, and by bus. And then he walked into the house one night, kissed my mom on Friday, got blind-ass drunk on Saturday, and went to work on Monday, swearing that the best and worst days of his life always seemed to begin with a hangover. Jesus, money was everywhere. The factory was still making glass, and that houses were going up so fast. And then the work started to taper off, and the Reeve family, who owned that factory, they somehow slipped how they ran that place. Well, everybody remembers those years when old lame Harry Reeve was in charge before his brother stepped in. But you know, at least when the Reeve family made tough business decisions, they knew the families that they made suffer. And I put a lot of the good years there alongside your dad. But as hard as we worked, the product wasn't selling. The changes that came to the factory all seemed necessary. But not much had changed in the school where we had gone. And some of those textbooks probably still had my name in them when you studied from. Earl, we kept our part of the bargain. We got played. The people who used our commitment realized they could take more and give us less. Wages went down to save our jobs, and benefits went away to protect the company's future. We pushed our mortgages out, and we bought American cars. Now she's gone. Nobody even knows who owns that factory anymore. Maybe nobody owns it, it's just a ghost. There was never no bargain. We just thought there was, and they just kept telling us there was. And we did our part. They slipped out the back door while we were wondering how we got from here to here. There. And I don't know anymore, Earl. I wish I could think of some way to set it back right, but I don't think that's going to happen. Some people see this as a dismantling of the past, almost nostalgia, but I wonder if it really just isn't the future. And at that point, in the mid-1970s, the factory closes. In fact, if you look at the trend lines in our economy, if you start back when we started keeping records in the 1800s, the income levels of rich people, because there always are rich people, there was going to be rich people, and poor people, rose at roughly the same level. They rose about 6% all the time. Every year there were dips, of course, but they averaged about a 6% rise from 18-something right up until the mid-1970s. And then we went over the top of the curve, and the wages of the working people went down, started to keep going down. And the money that the top people, the 1% we call it now, went like that. And suddenly those curves are going in opposite directions, and they're going there like bats out of hell. And what the characters in the book struggle to understand is what I think we all are struggling to understand is how did that happen? How did that happen over the course of a generation or two or three? How did our grandfathers start in the factory making $26 an hour back then to us graduating with 0, 0, 0, 0 after our student loans to the dissolution of the middle class, the end of industrialization, and now the creeping inroads into the middle class that is diluting it to the point where several million people lost their homes in 2008. Where did that money go? You know, it's not behind the dam in the Scioto River. It went up. It was the greatest redistribution of wealth in the United States in our history. And it has resulted in the greatest disparity of wealth between the people at the bottom and the people at the top that we have seen in the United States since the Great Depression.